just want to acknowledge my co-authors here and investigators that I've done some work with. This work is based on some research that Janine and I started some time ago, looking at rail driver health and well-being, and has now evolved into other streams of work, which we've brought some other truly incredible professors and luminaries really in their respective fields. And you can see there Cornel, Andreas, and Leon, our Leon. This is an infographic of the themes and topics that I research, and you can see me there going through the middle, River Anjum. I thought it'd be better to actually do something that shows my real passion and the work that I do, which is very much transport focused, but also rail focused. And you'll see some of the words that we've talked about today, like systems thinking and applied research and complex work and things like that, pretty much resonates all the way through the things that I do. So starting looking at preventive occupational ergonomics. So the idea really that, there's physical activity that can be very strenuous. Strenuous physical activity results in fatigue, poor performance, MSDs and things like that, we know this. But also you can have insufficient physical activity, which has now created what we recognize as an emerging hazard of our time, sedentary exposure. And that can also cause some serious issues. So a lot of people tend to use paradigms which get people to, actively commute or to work around work in some way, walking or exercising during breaks. The problem with these approaches is that whilst they have provided some, good outcomes, particularly in white-collar workers, they are reliant entirely on individual motivation, volitional behavior. And they also take time away from productive work. And so you've got this tension between these in these environments. Time for a bit of systems thinking, really, I guess. And that's where we end up thinking about Goldilocks. And the Goldilocks paradigm is something that has been used quite a bit in other areas. What I want to do really here is talk about the way that the Goldilocks work paradigm is now being used and considered in the context of physical activity in jobs. So if you think about physical load as the balance beam, if you've got a job where the physical load is too much, too frequent, or too prolonged, then you end up having ill health and loss of capacity. If you have a job where it's too little, too infrequent, too brief, you also have ill health and loss of capacity. And then there are also cases where you have combinations of both, which result in ill health and loss of capacity. What you want really is something in between. You want to design a work so the physical loading is sufficient to stimulate cardiometabolic and neuromuscular responses and is adequate for opportunities for recovery. That's really the sweet spot that we're after here. And that's what just right job design is all about. Important aspects to consider here are things like the intensity, duration, type, frequency, and the temporal pattern of physical loading, and then also the nature of tasks being productive, not taking too much time away from the actual core nature of the work to reduce the reliance on motivation. So how do you do it? 3 areas that you really got to think about and balance. You change the time pattern of tasks, you introduce new tasks, and you change how tasks are performed. These are the key tenets, really, of Goldilocks work. So, rail, finally, how this applies to rail and where it works. Now, rail, once upon a time, was a very different beast to what it is now. Look at this wonderful black and white picture of one locomotive driver and his fireman. And then on the right here, you have an example of a modern cab. This is a UK-based cab, and you'll see that it looks quite different. Over the years, the last 50 years or so, there's been a drift, from an environment where sitting was very high to now an environment where standing was very high and strenuous work was happening, to an environment now where actually they're sitting too long and you're locked in the seat for more than 2-3 hours in some cases. It's happened through legislation, mechanization, cultural factors, technical economic aids and automation. And if you really want to understand how this has happened over time, then unfortunately you need only look in the mirror, because we've been part of the issue, people. Our adherence to ergonomics, our adherence to occupational health and safety, minimizing musculoskeletal disorders, all these things have gradually created a drift, and now we're in a situation where we're past the just right position to a point now where drivers are physically unable to move out of that seat. There's a variety of devices keeping them locked in. And so how do we redress this? How do we move back? How do we think about how we change work? But first of all, why is it important? Well, waterfall in 2003 was a major disaster here in Australia, which has been attributed to a cardiac event of the driver. Lots of people died, and that sort of started a whole movement going around health assessment. We now know that in the driver population in Australia, there's a huge prevalence of diabetes and prediabetes. We're talking about hypertension issues, widespread obstructive sleep apnea, and also a prevalence of obesity. 1 in 2 train drivers in Australia is now seriously obese, and it's higher than the general population and increasing. Now, the looming job change, people might be thinking, well, driverless trains, Anjum. Well, that's kind of a misnomer. Very few networks will actually have true driverless trains. You're more likely to have a physical human being in the cab with very reduced input into what the train's doing, okay? Essentially turning what was an active role into a passive monitoring role. And in that scenario, we're actually looking at more sedentary exposure than we have currently, potentially. And so now, given that that's happening and people are thinking about it, now's a good time to think about job redesign and how we move along this really unusual sort of current state that we found ourselves at. So this is an example of just right job design, just to conceptualize it for you. This is an activitygram. You might have seen it before, and you can see stairs, running, walking, moving, all the physical activity profile on the left-hand side. This driver here, day starts at 7 and through to 5 o'clock. You can see there's very, very little movement. There's a bit of walking in the morning, a bit more, going into work, maybe getting onto the train around 8:30, and there's nothing until around 12, which is the meal break, and there's nothing again until later in the day. You could potentially, with Goldilocks Work, do this. Introduce more tasks, change the time pattern of tasks, and also change how tasks are performed. What we need to do is understand how we do this and what would work, and of course engage end users and various stakeholders in the process. But it's not outside the realm of possibility. We need to understand more about the task itself. So the aims of the study really were to test the efficacy of the job redesign idea in different tasks using the Goldilocks principle, and it was to evaluate the utility of a paper-based benchtop simulation process at this point. Okay, trying to get some, pilot data for something. Our research question was, does Goldilocks change how people think about work redesign at this point? So we're not looking to actually change the task. We're looking to work with a bunch of people, get them to actually, in a participative way, try to change some of the work to see if it is possible and feasible. So we went to a workshop at the APA Transform conference, which was earlier this year. It's predominantly a physiotherapy-based conference. And we used the following approach. So none of this really sophisticated STAMP, EAST, and cognitive work analysis stuff. We're talking about good old-fashioned Post-it notes, people. And we looked at different job scenarios, and train driving was one of them. So we went with more than just train driving to actually look at the degree of intractability that you have in different tasks. And so this was what the workshop looked like. We had an individual activity starting in the morning, where they just, a bit of an icebreaker, talked about healthy and unhealthy work. We had a group activity as well after that. That was the main meat. So we hadn't really talked about Goldilocks at this point, and what they had to do was create a task analysis and description of the job that they'd actually been assigned, okay? Once they did that, wasn't really an intervention, but we presented them we presented on Goldilocks, told them about Goldilocks, the 3 principles, what it's about and how it works. Once we did that presentation, we then asked them to redesign the job that they created, taking these principles in mind. The idea was to understand whether you can change the job and how they think about it, get their feedback, and at the end, with a reflection and feedback phase, really get to understand how that group worked and how they thought about these principles. This was an example that we gave them. Someone that has never drunk alcohol, it's an interesting one for me. Cellar door service manager, you can see at the top there, pale yellow Post-it notes, talking a little bit about the tasks that they have. You can see that, a cellar door service manager, at 3 p.m. will provide wine tasting experiences, pour some tastings, discuss wines, promote sales. And in this activity, there's some standing, some stepping, light intensity work, light forces, a bottle opening happening, some repetition, but there's no static loading. Come 4 o'clock after an hour, then they are preparing an activity report, sitting at a computer essentially now, So now they're thinking about sales customers, they were still working in the retail area, and now they're resting, there's light forces, some repetition, some static work. And then at 4:30, they're now restocking the cellar, carrying boxes upstairs, unpacking fridge and shelves. Oh, really? Oh yeah, it is, you're right. Fridge shelves, warehouse, cellar door, walking. Now they're doing manual handling. There's moderate forces, moderate intensity, some repetition, and no static loading at all. And so what we did was we asked them, we gave them their tasks, and then they had a whole load of post-it notes, and they were meant to design task descriptions in this way. So you can see here Leon talking about Goldilocks at the workshop with the people that were in there. And then you can see them getting up and going around to the four corners of the room to do their task analyses with good old-fashioned post-it notes. You can see here their changeover that they created. They had to create the job and the person. Changeover's name is Alfred. He's 45 years old. He's been a fitter and a turner. He's overweight, stressed about work. He's stressed about divorce and the family situation, commutes to work, 20, 30 minutes. And then they created the task description for a person with that profile. Okay, and you can see the description developing there. And this was the final task description. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of sitting happening, a bit of standing here and there, no activity, well, very minimal activity associated with moderate, vigorous movement, and very little associated with walking and light activity. This was their redesign. Okay. So you can see here that there's a great deal more enmeshment between the sitting and the standing throughout the day, following the Goldilocks process. You can see that they've split up the task, broken up in more, I guess, in a different way than it was before. So there's a big change there, but predominantly the only thing that they could think about with the train driver was essentially, well, maybe we need to have a sit-stand console in the train. It's a very intractable environment. That introduces new considerations, new challenges, but they started thinking outside the box and saying, well, what if we had policy change? What if we actually had technology capability in the cab that would give them not just the option, but actually create that change for them so it was part of the environment. It was happening there. There were still constraints around getting off the train, on and off the train, but they did introduce tasks that were platform-based. They did introduce tasks that were associated with inspection work as well. So they started to think really about how this could work and how it could be feasible. So we asked them a bit about, whether they think it's likely to be implemented in many workplaces. We got their thoughts. And you can see here that 58 of them said, yes, we think it is. And 41% of them said that they're not sure. They're not sure. So just to contextualize that, what's good about the approach? Some of them said, well, it's good because you're taking the responsibility of the change to the management instead of the worker. It's a practical application. It could be easily described to a range of stakeholders. It can be used as an educational element as well, so it has utility in these areas. It's a participatory approach, and it has that visual aspect. So they could really imagine like train drivers, unions, middle managers, executives even sitting down in the room and saying, let's look at what our needs are here. How do we balance your health with productivity? What do you think could be improved? So people that were unsure, maybe, they were concerned about the practicality of implementation of the changes, so start thinking more about the dollar value. Talking about adding other elements, so obviously the focus is on physical activity, but you've got to think about psychosocial risk factors. But the moment you start to introduce that in, they by their own admission said, oh, hang on a second, that might actually make things really, really complex. Do we want to do things in a more meaningful, mindful way? It's difficult to cover all aspects of physical demand, so we're thinking about how best to do that, and obviously getting the employees on board. Next question was about whether it's changed how they think about work design. So we had a lot of people saying that it did, a few people saying that it didn't, and those that said they didn't really said, well, we're already thinking this way. People that were familiar with either the process or the way that it works. There was also a concern that the jobs are changing so fast that the new design already encompasses these principles. Well, there's a lot of environments where, I know that doesn't really happen at all. So maybe that was a nuanced view. So just a couple of slides. Research aims there. We think that the Goldilocks work is likely to afford job redesign in different tasks on the strength of just this pilot work. We think that this actual process that we use, whilst very, very low fidelity, has good utility, particularly at the early stages when you're starting to do stuff. And also, I think, given the feedback from the people in the room, it's possible that it would really change work design. Train driving is a really intractable environment, though. And so the reason why I'm presenting on that here is because if we can crack it here and understand how you can do it here, then transferability into environments that are similarly intractable and where looming health concerns and crises are now very, very topical, you could find some real good opportunities for good research and application there. I think that, you know, given where we are with automation and all the rest of that sort of stuff, it's a good rhetoric in the world at the moment to think about how this could empower drivers and actually bring unions on board rather than making them think about technology takeover and, you know, the end of the jobs as we know it. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions for Anjum.
Grace, please be graceful about your question.
It won't be too hard. I'm just wondering if the participants had to consider things like the impact of stress and timings, because as the train drivers, I gather that it's often they're trying to meet the targets to get to, you know, their train timetables on running. So how do they, you know, have time to get out on the platforms and or do these other activities?
Yeah, so when we were asking them to redesign work, we also asked them to consider redesigning the stopping pattern and the schedule, because if you're going to be getting people off the train moving around, then that will have to also create a significant shift in the way that people think about performance and KPIs. But we are at the state really where we do need to start challenging the timetable, because that's part of the reason why, as you've just described, there is that constraint happening. Drivers are really thinking about moving quick, moving time, and it's not just the physical aspects. The constraint really is a physical manifestation of a lot of the psychological stresses that the drivers face. So a lot of the times when they were redesigning the work in that particular group, they were saying, these are the kinds of things that we're going to have to think about with our policy change. Exactly, yes.
Introduction of ETCS, it's even worse because you're increasing the frequency of the trains.
Exactly.
Liz, did you have a question? Liz.
Thanks, Anjum. I just wondered, have you had much feedback from the rail companies? You've obviously had drivers involved, but have you had any feedback?
So we haven't had any drivers involved in this particular research yet, but we have had rail companies talk to us, work with us, particularly management and staff. A lot of the times when you talk to them, it's in a too hard basket. It's very hard to think how you would achieve a future where you have drivers that essentially are more flexible than they are currently. When we've worked with them and got their support, a lot of it's been about going and starting in the future and then doing a reverse history and working our way back. So we haven't had the conversations with union, well, we have actually had conversations with unions, but we haven't had conversations with drivers just yet. But our narrative really here is around protecting jobs and ensuring that if there is going to be the potentially inevitable change associated with the redesign of work as a result of automation, that we need to find a task, or we need to think about the tasks they're doing, which recognize these sort of the interstices with their physical activity. Yes, Yvonne, another rail person. All the rail people are asking me questions. Why is that, I wonder?
Have you thought about the potential impacts of moving away from timetabling, just like service every 4 minutes, every 5 minutes, and in the way that Metro is working, and the impacts of that as a potential?
So moving from the current sort of fixed table to a
turn up,
yeah. So we haven't thought about that yet, but that is one of the paradigms and models that people are using to address a lot of the constraints around timekeeping, but it comes with its own sorts of issues. The issue is, one of the main issues is that you've got to track how you're doing, and you need to be able to report how well you're doing to other agencies, and it's very hard to do that with a semi-flexible framework. So that's why I'm sort of saying that it will call for a change in systems and the current ways of thinking, which Goldilocks is trying to do effectively. Are you a rail person?
Getting a work.
Awesome.
You were saying about how it's moved down the other end of the scale because of automation and a lot of the stuff, that whether really it's a job that perhaps should be fully automated and that train drivers are maybe blacksmiths?
So what's your question?
Do you have an opinion on that? Like, do you think it's suitable to automation that would go that way? Get rid of train drivers?
How do I put this? So rail driving as a task is highly amenable to technology takeover. And I've been in quite a few rail environments in the world and seen how things work. I'm going to be biased here because I really am quite passionate about rail driving psychology and about the way that the person within the cab functions, because I think that task is incredibly skill-based, requires quite sophisticated quasi-mathematical computations. I think that it's only some environments that you probably will have the technology take over working in a way where it will be fully automated. But I think that most people that are riding in the back of trains will always want to know that there's a human being at the front, because there are other sorts of psychological, elements there.
Part of the reason why I asked that question is I was just sort of thinking about the incredible effort that seems to be going into trying to develop autonomous cars for the roadway, and I was sort of thinking it'd be a lot easier to do it on a rail network, surely.
Yeah, the difficulty with the rail network, if I just get very technical, is that it's very hard to model starting and stopping on the rail in comparison to the road, because you're dealing with steel wheels on steel rail, and so you've got all sorts of adhesion issues which are very difficult to model reliably and accurately. So that's one of the first technical challenges. But I think that there is a future where you have a human being in the cab that's doing what pilots do at the moment, where they are checking off a whole load of things, trying to remain in the loop, but also essentially developing other skills, management skills, potentially even skills associated with differential diagnosis if the train breaks down. Because if that train breaks down and there's no human there, what do you do then? Because trains do break down, they break down quite a lot. Similarly, if you have lots of obstacles in the track and you need to avoid them, or you need to enact emergency, we know that with a lot of the automatic cars, the radar systems aren't always that sophisticated. These sorts of technologies might be going to the train. So I think that these are important questions. I don't think that the job is obsolete quite yet, and I don't think it will be for quite some time unless we completely get rid of all the railways that most of the countries have and replace them with very, very different railways, lots of bridges, lots of tunnels, no level crossings, all those other things that come into play to ensure that you've got that dependability.
Thanks, Anjum.
Lots of questions.